Deirdre Madden is a writer from Tunbridge, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. The author of 8 acclaimed novels, she has twice been a finalist for the Women's Prize for Fiction 2009 and 1996, and has received numerous other awards and honors, including the Hennessy Literary Awards Hall of Fame, the Somerset Maugham Award, and the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature. Madden's narratives often begin from a deceptively simple premise, the birthday of a friend, a chance meeting with a stranger, from which emerge complex and elegant meditations on art and experience, love and knowledge, memory and meaning. In her novel, Time Present and Time Past, a character watches the ticking hands of a clock, reflecting that sometimes he feels he can almost hear time rushing past him. It is like a kind of unholy wind. Madden's stories show us how we are both bound and freed by the, quote, the unholy wind of time. Her characters' lives are intersected by extraordinary events, some political, the Troubles, some economic, the rise and fall of the Celtic Tiger, some personal, all sudden openings that offer the rare opportunity for transformation and even transcendence. Madden holds a BA from Trinity College Dublin and an MA from the University of East Anglia. She has been a member of Asordana, the affiliation of creative artists in Ireland, since 1997, and is currently an associate professor of creative writing and co-director of the MPhil in creative writing at Trinity College Dublin. Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you for being here in conversation, and thank you to everyone at the gallery.
Thank you all for coming along. I hope you can all hear, and if at any stage you can't at all, just wave and we'll try and project a bit more, because if you can't hear, it don't work.
Yeah. So I wanted to start by just sort of introducing the premise of this talk, which you posed to me, or I guess I was
drawn into it.
Drawn into it. And the sort of kernel of that was that you had expressed an interest in siblings and collaboration across sibling lines in art and life. And I was wondering if you could possibly just briefly describe what that kernel came out of, why you were interested in that, either as an author or in the context of this festival.
How this came about. So Mike Kelleher, who's one of the director of the Windham-Campbell prizes, we had a chat on Zoom about the different events that I might do. And I told him that I was very interested in art, so that was a thought that we had. I also had to do a podcast, and I did a podcast with him on Marilyn Robinson's book, Housekeeping, which is such a beautiful novel, really marvelous. And 2 of the main characters in that are 2 sisters. And in discussing that in the podcast, I mentioned as well how central an idea sisters or siblings, indeed, it can be brothers, sisters, or sisters and brothers, or brothers and brothers, how central an idea that was in my own work, as was art. So I talked to this came up again when Mike was asking what other event I would do once we had the podcast done, and because I had already discussed siblings, he asked me was I interested in doing something in that. And I thought about it and I said, a thing that really interests me is artists and their siblings, because I think in so many, that has ramifications in so many ways. Like one person I was thinking of very much was Vincent van Gogh and his brother Theo, who was an art dealer, and he was absolutely central and crucial to Vincent's life, encouraging him, giving him money, supporting him. They were tremendously close, and I think that Theo only outlived Van Gogh by a couple of years. I was also very interested in the Bronte sisters when I was growing up, and that was a whole family of artists, of artists and writers. Again, and this leads us to collaboration, which I'll talk about with Julia. As children, they worked on little books together. They did a lot of drawings and paintings, and of course then they became very renowned as writers. And they had a brother, the Bronte sisters had one brother called Branwell, who was also extremely gifted and who wanted to be a painter. He was more interested in painting than literature. And his life didn't come to anything really. He developed a great drink problem. Their father, as you probably know, was a clergyman, and he led a very dissolute life and died very young, and I suppose you could say brought great shame on the family and their relationship. And again, I think that's something that you often find, that there is someone in a family who is an artist and someone else who maybe should have been an artist, but that doesn't happen for them. So I began to feel that this was very, very fertile ground. And Mike said that he would look into that and maybe we could do something in the art gallery here. And he found Julia for me. And Julia was the perfect match because she is a visual artist and also has done a lot of collaboration with her sister, and you might like to say something about that at this point.
Sure. So yes, I am a painter, and my sister is a poet, and we have been collaborating for over a decade, ironically most often at a distance. We haven't lived in the same city since 2007, which is when she went to college. And so all of our collaboration has actually been primarily through the mail as a space, as a medium that is both very physical, because it's literally the movement of objects from one geography to another. And it's kind of, I would say, been shaped by the constraint of not being in the same place. Sometimes it's actually harder to work with someone when you live with them because you're so close that you don't even see each other. But there's something that happens over distance and over time that I think can be a really productive challenge in the creative process. And that's actually something that when you mentioned Van Gogh in the very beginning of our conversations, he was one of the very, I guess, one of the most well-known artists in my own mind that did have that kind of sibling relationship. And of course, as we know, Theo was not an artist. He was much more of a supporter. But it made me think about the relationship that you have painted in the book Authenticity, which is mostly the lens through which I've come to understand some of your work. And I'll briefly say something, and then I can ask you a question about that specific relationship. So it's a story of, I would say, a painter that is sort of told by way of his family, which consists of 4 siblings. He is one of 4, and then also this relationship that he has with another artist. And in this book, Roderick, the painter, is in many ways supported by Dennis, his brother, who is not a painter, but does provide this kind of support. And I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of not only the financial and the sort of like practical ways that Dennis was a support, but also the more emotional and less tangible ways that you think that kind of relationship manifests as you wrote it.
Yes. There are 2, I have a different edition, same book. In this novel, I suppose one of the main characters is a man called Roderick. It's set in Dublin, and he's an artist, and he's a very successful artist, but he has had a very troubled life. He's got a broken marriage behind him. He's had a lot of problems with drinking, and his family have never approved of his being an artist, or for the most part, with the exception of his brother Dennis, they weren't supportive at all of him when he started out as a young man trying to be a painter, except for his brother Dennis. Now, Dennis wanted to be a concert pianist, also had that interest, but didn't really have the courage to follow that vocation through, and has lived a very different life, but really loves his brother and has supported him in that way. And the book sort of looks at how that can be a wonderful thing, but how it can also be very, very difficult, and how it can lead to dependencies, and it can be quite problematic. And it explores this whole idea of, I suppose, a vocation. I've always felt that art, be it writing or painting or visual arts, I still have this idea, which I suppose is quite old-fashioned now, of it being very much a vocation. And if you feel it, you have to really follow through on it and have the courage of your convictions. And sometimes it means you have to give up things, like you might not make much money for a very long time, you might never make much money from it. There are certain, to follow that, and the way people perceive you as well. Often, like, parents are not happy when children come home and say, I want to be a painter, I don't want to go to law school, I don't want to do medicine, I'm going to do art. So the sort of struggle against those. And when your family helps you and encourages you with that, if you're lucky enough, as I was, and Julia was as well, to be born into a family where you are supported and encouraged, that makes it so much easier. And so in this novel, like, Dennis's encouragement of his brother and his support and practical and financial help really helps Roderick with his life when everything else is sort of pushing against him.
And I think there's a moment, a lot of the book is written in the third person, so we kind of have this bird's eye view, but there is one particular chapter about a third of the way through, which consists entirely of letters, that we then get this first person voice of Roderick writing to Dennis. And that made me think a lot about, again, this kind of support that it didn't seem like the letters were in the same realm of the practical money support, but the fact that he had a sort of vessel, you might say, to hold his thoughts, his inner feelings, and that Dennis really was that sort of vessel, you might say.
Yes, yeah. A thing I feel is a real tragedy is the rise of technology and the decline of a lot of the analog things that I found so beautiful, like letters and the time they took to get to someone, and then they would read them and reflect on things before responding. Everything now is so immediate and it's back and forth and broken up. When Maureen was showing me around the gallery before the event, she took me through to show me the Van Gogh, and if you haven't seen it already, you should go through the one of the cafe in the south of France. And in the note beside it, there's a long quote from the letters of Van Gogh. And again, this links up beautifully with your work, Julia. He wrote his whole life to his brother. In the early stages, communicating very much like his religious fervor. He wanted to be a clergyman in the first instance. But as you can see in this, he discussed very much. He obviously couldn't take a photograph of what he was working on and say, here, Theo, look at this. So he wrote these long, incredibly beautiful, very technical descriptions of the colors. He was painting the interior of a cafe and how the lights changed the colors of the clothes and how the walls were supposed to reverberate, and the very precise nature of the colors that he was using, and that he had, if he wanted to communicate that to Theo, who wasn't there with him, he had to do it through letters. At that stage, it was the only medium. And that he then would have to reflect and think exactly what color, how would I describe that color? And to have all these accounts of his artistic intention, and then to look at the actual work, this huge body of work and this huge body of letters to his brother, who he completely trusted in this world. And he knew his brother loved art as well, was an art dealer and understood painting. And it's an extraordinary repository of work and a wonderful sort of gloss to Van Gogh's creativity. And this is also why Julia was just the perfect match, because this idea of letters as well forms a very big part of your artistic practice. And again, at this stage, maybe if you want to say a bit more about that, Julia.
Sure. And it feels very fitting that we're here at Yale having this conversation, because as I said, me and Anne-Marie Rooney, the name of my sister, we have been collaborating for over a decade. But it had not previously been really publicly formalized in any way. I had not ever shown this work. We had never really made anything of it. We kind of were just doing it always in the background with our own creative practices, independent. When I was a student here from 2016 to 18 in the MFA program, studying painting, of course, I was doing the painting work in my studio on my own. It's a very sort of individualized program. But all the time, I was also continuing to do this collaborative work with Anne-Marie. And what ended up coming out of it after 2 years, basically, I kind of had this reflection where I said, this also informs the painting I do. It wasn't very legible at first, and it took quite a few months of kind of looking at it and thinking, oh, this is also work, and this is actually maybe as important as the painting work. So one of the pieces that we ended up producing together is a folio of risographs. Risograph is a kind of print. It's a very cheap kind of print. It's sort of like a Xerox, but it's made with a particular kind of ink. And this sort of open folio of pieces consists of a combination of text, which is text that I wrote to her, I emailed her, and objects that were scanned on a flatbed scanner that she had mailed me. So basically what this project came out of was she would be sending me on a very, very regular basis, like kind of an obsessive basis, things in the mail. Like every day I would come home and there would be something in the mail for me. And often it was something of no consequence, like objects, pieces of paper, snippets of poetry, drafts, to-do lists, just kind of the flotsam and jetsam of life. Probably a lot of it was just trash that she was trying to get rid of. And I became the receptacle of this trash, and I say that lovingly. We're both very interested in trash and what people throw away and what it says about them. So I became, the sort of recipient, and over time, the way I would sort of acknowledge that I had received these things is I would write her an email. So she was sending me objects, and I was sending her emails, which is sort of ironic because she's the writer and I'm the maker of objects. And then we basically produced this folio of, again, text that was sort of like a receipt of acknowledgement, like when you get a text message and it says, recipient has read your message. It was sort of like that. And it, I think, was the first time that we had, again, like kind of produced something that was truly our own making, but again, had happened over such a distance. And part of that important thing of like what happens when you don't get an immediate response. It's not like this day and age where you just know someone has read your email the second it's sent, even if they don't respond to you. Yes. And that's something that, I think is so evident in your book, the way you think about time and the way that you kind of build a narrative that is not linear. It's not like I know this thing happened and then that thing happened. It's very much stitched together fragments of different time spaces.
Yes. I mean, when Julie and I were preparing for this talk, we had a few meetings on Zoom, and she told me about this work, and I think you sent me a photograph of the front of the folder, and I saw it. But I have to say, it was only yesterday when we got together and she showed me these things. And for example, the envelope that she has just held up, she said, like, I'll bring these to the gallery. And I said, that's a great idea. But it's when I saw them in reality that they really spoke to me. And again, I think that comes back to the idea of like real things. And I think we live in an increasingly dematerialized world, or virtual. Let's use the word that is the right word. It's a virtual world, and people can even have like a virtual drink together. They've got virtual selves, they've got avatars. And with that then, it's quite exciting to get like a real thing. And so to see the letters and the artwork that Julia has done, to see them in the folder, and she has stressed very, yes.
This object is the remains of, anyway.
An envelope, that came along. And they, to engage with real things, I think is really important. And I was very glad to have these along, and how they relate to time. I think that this brings us back to that question of time. Objects in time, people in time, it's the element in which we live, and how we perceive things differently as time passes. For example, the envelope, if you have there again, the little envelope, Julia, that you had earlier. Sorry if it's still there.
Yeah. And there's some other things.
Yeah. Yeah, like the glitter on that, the stamps, I mean, I'm quite traditional in many ways, and when I started looking at art, it was very much like a painting on a wall. And some of the paintings, maybe even like that painting, would have been too much for me. I would have thought, what's that all about? You know, I was very traditional. And it took me a long time simply of looking at art. I've never studied art as a subject. I've just gone to galleries. I've read quite a lot about it. And to get to the stage where like conceptual art, I think is the correct term, work that is very contemporary, sometimes like dealing with quite ephemeral things, to get to the point where I could understand that. And like something like this now, I really get. And what I get from it is, it's, you know, the reality of it. By taking it out, it is a letter, but you're taking it out of its context, which is a simple letter at home, a letter from your sister, and you're looking at it in a different way. And I don't know how old this is, like how long ago was this sent?
2016 or 17, somewhere in that
yes,
realm.
yeah. Well, the more time goes on, the more unusual this will, the more unusual this will look, because the stamps will become very old-fashioned. Even handwriting, maybe people aren't going to write like this any longer. I mean, yesterday I was taken to the Beinecke Library to see some of the archive there, and there was a letter from Langston Hughes, and to look at it, and it was, you know, written by him, but it was typed. And again, that, you know, old-fashioned sort of typed letter on a little square of paper, already that looks like so old and from so long ago. And how time works upon art objects. And here's the thing that's really amazing. I think that when, with an artwork that is absolutely extraordinary, it keeps its freshness. It really does not date. If you look at Van Gogh, the energy is still in the paintings, and it's why pictures that even are hundreds of years old can still really hit you with a real blow. They can almost sort of pull you across the room when you go into the gallery. And even though they're from a different social world, if I could put it that way, they remain very fresh and very telling. The energy that comes from them is still there. So
I have so many points to mention, to like follow up on in what you just said, and I think one of the things that you do so well in this book is you kind of create a there's two time spaces that I most feel in this. It's the past that feels like it's all about memory that has happened, but then it's also this type of, I don't want to say it's the future tense, it's like the subjunctive tense. It's the tense of things that could have happened, that might happen still, that never will happen, but that are sort of gestating in the characters. And I feel like it's mostly in this character who wants to have been a painter but never does, never realizes that. Yes. And that's a very, the way that you somehow are able to create a reality of that, even though it's, again, something that never has happened and probably never will happen, is remarkable. And my question, I guess, is how do you feel that kind of the tense of the things that never have happened interacts with the characters' relationships? Like how do I don't know, is the relationship between the characters sort of an imagined one, or is it all one that is happening in like real time? I don't know if that's a clear question.
I think it's happening in real time. I will say, I'm glad you brought up the subject of time again. Time is, for me, one of the great subjects of literature, and it's something I've written about a lot. I've written a novel called Time Present and Time Past, and what it's about, the clue is in the title. And it's written in the present tense because I sort of needed it to be in the present so you could sort of then look back and look forward, and it speculates into the future as well. Again, it's a book that deals very much with siblings and with families. It's very much focused on a man called Fintan, and he's remembering his childhood. He has a sister he's very close to. He has two sons who are totally unlike each other. But the main theme of the book, there is a theme of visual work as well. It's more concerned with photography than with painting. And again, it's how we read time in photographs. And I mean, the trigger for that was I had always seen photographs of the First World War, and they were very black and fuzzy. And then suddenly one day, possibly on the internet, I must confess, I saw a colour photograph from the First World War. And it was a real colour photograph, like it wasn't a photograph that had been treated. And I was really surprised because I hadn't thought colour photography was such an old thing. And I was even more surprised because I felt much closer. It was nurses and wounded soldiers in a hospital, and it looked much more immediate and relatable than the black and white fuzzy ones from the battlefield. And it showed me how I was confusing the medium with the thing itself. Like they were both from the same period of time, but how I was perceiving these scenes, the battlefield and the hospital scene, was different. So it made me really think about photography a lot and how we imagine the past, which is sort of to get back to your question, like how we perceive the past. And you might think, well, you might be able to remember the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, whatever, and you might think, okay, it must have been like this in the early 20th century, 19th century. How far back can you go? You know, what was it like in ancient Greece? To sort of think your way into time, and that is something I found interesting, and to talk about that. So yes, I think it's a huge subject, and in this book, people are remembering their past, and how you change your own memories of things. Like things happen and then you'll remember it a different way because you don't really want to remember it the way it really was, and you idealize things. Or if you talk to somebody else who was there, they'll say, no, it wasn't like that. And how everybody perceives things differently is important. So
on that note, there's a passage that may I read a paragraph of this? Absolutely. And it's specifically about how a painter imagines reality, and I think it has to do with time, but it also has to do with imagination versus the real, and how I think murky that is for a child, right? What is real to a child? Everything is real to a child. Yes. What is real to a painter? And so there's this passage where one of the characters in the book, whose name is Julia, who is a painter, is recalling how she became a painter. And it's this memory of her talking to her father. And she says, so deep, or the author, Deirdre, writes, so deep was her pleasure in the scene she had conjured up that she decided to share something of it with her father. Quote, I like to think, she said to him, about how, when the painter had finished this picture, he ate the pie. And they're talking about a painting. Yes. His response knocked her flat. Quote, maybe there was never a pie, he said. Maybe the painter made it all up. For a moment, she literally couldn't speak. So extraordinary was the idea. What do you mean, she said at last. How could there not have been a pie? And then her father replies, maybe he just imagined one from all the pies he had seen and eaten in his life. He might have painted it from a sort of picture he had in his head rather than from a real thing. If he was as good a painter as all that, he probably just made up what he painted, having in his mind all the pies and glasses and knives and tables and silver cups that he had ever seen in his life. Don't you think that's possible? She didn't know. The idea had never occurred to her. She only knew that what he said destroyed at a stroke the pleasing image she had cultivated in her mind of the man with paint on his hands and crumbs on his lips, sitting in the sunshine, as delighted with himself and his work as she had been. And I think that story, it's so full of the wonder of childhood and also the wonder of painting. And it, at the same time, asks this profound question of what is it that we experience and what is it that we remember? And I think when you're also thinking back to your childhood, there's so many things that you remember in a visceral way, but you don't actually recall the details because your mind has not formed fully, but you still remember smells, you remember evocative notes, like flavors, more than you remember images. Yes. And you do such a tremendous job of kind of creating these characters in a way that as a reader, it feels like a dreamscape in a certain sense. They're very tangible, and at the same time, you're kind of toying with the idea of, is this a memory? Is this a dream? Is this, and it's not immediately evident, and then it sort of builds over the course of a chapter, and then the chapters build into the course of a book.
Yes, yeah. And how those things like memory and imagination, they're very, very closely linked, and sometimes they're impossible to tell apart. You know, you really aren't, you know, you couldn't possibly have remembered something, but you feel it very strongly in your mind, and it is the force of the imagination. I actually think imagination is something we don't talk enough about anymore. You don't often hear, at least I don't hear that word used. And if it is, it's used sometimes in like almost a disapproving way, whereas it's such a rich, marvelous thing and a real tool. And there's nothing wrong with it being linked to memory, you know, because we are where we are right now, and you can't get back to your life as you were on one particular day when you were 7 years old, you know, when you saw a certain thing, but you can cultivate your memory of that and live with it and maybe enhance it a bit and talk to other people and think about it. And your whole mind and your whole sense of the world and your sense of yourself is composed very much of thoughts like that.
A related word that I would like to enter here is intuition, which I think is another word that is sometimes sort of disparaged in the art world, because it doesn't actually have, there's no way to locate where and what intuition is.
Yes, you can't really pin it down.
You can't pin it down. It's not a smart word. It's like in academia, I feel like it's sometimes just this.
It's a feeling.
It's a feeling. It's something that's.
And the art world doesn't really like that.
The art world does not like.
Academia does not like the
does not like feelings because they're not explainable. They're not knowable. Yes. And I think there's something about sibling relationships that maybe you can talk about, where I've heard it said that there's sometimes an unspoken understanding that occurs between a sibling that is really in touch with another sibling. It's like you don't have to say anything and everything is already known. And it has something to do with having grown up in a space where all of the references from the age of, you know, a baby to where you just have this unspoken understanding. Yes. And I wonder also how you think that manifests in art, like that kind of unknowing yet deep knowledge of what it is to write or what it is to make a painting, or, you know, because I don't know if it always can be located. And at least that's my experience of it. I don't know if that's similar to your writing.
Yeah, I agree with what you say about siblings. I think that when you're very close to, if you have a very good childhood and you're very, very close to your sister, brothers, or all the rest, I think your heart remains very pure in relation to them. That has been my experience. And that in a strange way, even though you're relating to this person as an adult when you're adults, there's a very, very deep level where it's still like you're 5. You don't even need language. You're just connected in that visceral, I suppose, as well as intuitive way. And so much so that you possibly don't even think about it very much until you have to, or maybe a circumstance obliges you to. And I think it is what you say as well, related to that. And it's even different to the relationship with parents, because you're aware that they have this whole other life that you didn't have a part of. And children often really resent their parents' early life. They don't like the idea. I remember a little boy I knew, and he was really annoyed when he found out his mother had, you know, that's me years. Where am I? Oh, you didn't even exist at that age. What? And I think that, you know, again, it's related to time, you know, where you're situated and the resentment of not being there. Whereas with your siblings, there may be just like a year or two, maybe, that you're apart from them, and other than that, you have this whole shared life that you can remember.
Yeah.
Julia, I want to give you that back. And there's another little passage, if it's okay, I might read from this. and I'll talk a little bit about Julia's work as well. Julia, and you can talk about it too, as well as this, the more contemporary work that Julia is doing, she is a painter. And I've seen very interesting interview conducted by someone between Julia and her sister, who is a poet. And she has made artwork. Maybe you should talk more about this. Like, you have made quite, they're like abstract impressionist paintings. They're paintings very much engaged with color, but then you've put them into installations that your sister has made. Could you maybe talk a bit about that? Because then I'm going to read about paintings.
Sure. So the body of work that Deirdre is referring to is a series of paintings that I made when I was at a residency in 2022 at a place called Soaring Gardens, and it was the first time Anne-Marie and I had ever shared a space, a creative space, ever, but also actually since childhood. It was a studio that we worked in together, and she was primarily composing a manuscript. Most of the writing had been done, but she was involved with kind of ordering the poems, and I was in the same room painting. It was maybe a room that maybe was like half this size, so we were very much in each other's space. And we were there for about a month, and I created a body of work that all came actually out of these found frames. I had brought with me old frames, all old wooden frames, all different, none of them in good condition, none of them precious. And all of the paintings I made in the frame. The frame was almost like the seed that led to what the painting became. So as opposed to framing a painting after it's made, it was sort of like the painting was born in the frame. And I ended up naming each of these paintings with lines from a poem that my sister wrote, but I don't think ever thought was fully finished or maybe was successful. She sort of shared this poem with me, and she said, like, do something with it. And I don't know if at that time it was considered a fully finished poem. The poem now is finished. It's called ESP, and this is the actual printout. I printed it out, and I sort of, as I made the work, I sort of circled parts of the piece that I liked, and the paintings were all sort of named after these. Some examples are Through the Belling Music, The Squirm Before the Thought, I Feel Pink Like Sick, Every Situation Discusses a Line. And so it's the series of lines. And then 2 years later, we exhibited these paintings and some of her writing in a gallery, a small artist-run gallery in New York called Below Grand, and it was this sort of installation of the paintings and then also her writing sort of living around them. And it was the first time we had put our work into a physical public space together. So maybe that's a good answer.
Yes. I hope you'll agree, but what I've seen of the paintings, they reminded me a bit in their nature of Roderick's work as well, which was another very happy match for this. And I want to talk about the screen. Don't let me forget about the screen. So I want to read a little section from the novel, which I hope will give you some visual sense of what Roderick, the painter in the novel, what his work looked like. It's a little scene where his brother Dennis, who was the guy who wanted to be a pianist, has come home at night and from his day job, and he is wandering around his own house looking at things and thinking about things, and it describes him looking at the art, so I think it should be fairly. So Roderick is the painter and Dennis is his brother. If you think Roderick is Vincent and Theo is Dennis, or Dennis is Theo. Glass in hand, Dennis wandered aimlessly through the house, looking at his paintings. Over the years, almost by default, he had amassed a considerable collection of his brother's work. The earliest, a small, fluent watercolor of the house itself, that Roderick had painted and framed as a housewarming gift when he was an art student was perhaps Denis's favourite, although Roderick dismissed it as a trifle and would even be faintly annoyed if its merits were too much insisted upon. The drawing room was dominated by a huge canvas, and that too had been a gift given to him by his brother shortly after he'd left hospital. Roderick was an abstract painter. His mature style, which had evolved in the years after his return to Ireland, and for which he had recently achieved much acclaim, consisted of stripes executed in pastel colours. His canvases likened memorably by one critic to the pale flags of imaginary countries. Intelligent, haunting, and luminous were words frequently used to describe his work. Denis thought the critics were at a loss to know what to say about paintings with no subject. For the truth was, and Denis would admit this to no one, didn't even like to admit it to himself, he didn't particularly like abstract art. Even though he had actually bought some of the paintings he owned, he had done so only out of kindness, only to help Roderick out of the occasional financial black hole. He wouldn't have given them house room had they been painted by anyone else. And yet his attachment to them was considerable, although emotional rather than aesthetic. He couldn't imagine now living without his paintings. Even so, he hadn't wanted the big painting in the drawing room. In truth, he hadn't. Looking at it as he sipped his cranberry juice, at the bands of pink oils melding into cream, into soft blue, he remembered the day Roderick had summoned him to the studio, pointed to the canvas and said simply, "It's for you." Denis hoped that his immediate reaction, "God, no, Roderick, I simply can't possibly accept such a gift," had sounded like consternation at his brother's generosity rather than simple alarm. But he'd insisted, wouldn't take no for an answer. "It's for you, Denis. I want you to have it. If you like, I'll come to your house and help you hang it, advise you how to show it to best effect." It had taken the 3 years that had passed since then for Denis to understand what Roderick had been doing in giving him the painting. It was, as he had said at the time, a thank you for everything he'd done for him down the years. Not that anything could ever adequately repay you, Denis. But it was also, Denis gradually realised, a farewell present. Roderick was withdrawing from him in a particular and final way, becoming distinctly separate from him for perhaps the first time in their adult lives. And although he had always thought that this would be a good thing, that it was something he actively wanted, now that it was happening, he wasn't quite so sure. No, not sure at all. In all of this, the actual painting was somehow incidental to Denis, a symbol rather than the thing itself. He didn't understand what it meant until Roderick borrowed it back, together with a couple of his other canvases, for the retrospective of his work that had taken place a year ago. It had been a remarkable critical success and had definitively confirmed his reputation as a painter. Denis was the only member of the Kennedy family to attend the opening of the exhibition, and in this there was nothing new. His sisters had always shown scant interest in Roderick's work. Watercolours framed and given to Clean and Maeve for Christmas many years earlier had been coolly received and never displayed. Denis suspected that they might even have destroyed them, and his sister's indifference annoyed him more than it troubled Roderick. that they didn't understand the paintings, simply hadn't a clue what their brother meant by his daubs, and were amazed that anyone else saw merit in his work, was, as far as Dennis was concerned, no excuse, because he didn't understand the work either. Forget about understanding, Roderick used to implore him. There is nothing to understand. Just look at the damn thing and enjoy it. It was no reason not to be supportive. If Roderick believed in what he was doing, that was enough for Dennis. It was an act of faith, like believing in some particular religious teaching to do with, say, the fate of the dead and life to come, that ran in complete opposition to common sense and logic, which was irresistible. At least Dennis found it so. So, imagination again. I imagined what Roderick's paintings looked like, and a couple of the artists that I had in mind were Agnes Martin, who's an American abstract painter, and maybe Sean Scully as well, although the colour's quite different, very much like stripes and that sort of energy and the beauty of the colour itself coming off them.
I wonder, even the Rothko behind us, I have this in the, oh, that is a Sean Scully, I believe, maybe?
Yes, that is a Sean Scully, I think. And oh, I didn't know there's a
Rothko
Rothko around the corner like that as well. A tremendous artist. Are there any other areas, Julia, we need to cover? Yes. Related to time, could you talk a little bit about the project you did, and again this was with your sister, of the screen that you carried through New York? Because again, how that relates to time as well as sibling collaboration, I think is very germane to this.
Sure. That also actually, now that I'm thinking, it does also feel very pertinent to New Haven and to Yale. I started a series of paintings in 2021. During the sort of height of the pandemic, these paintings were collectively called green screen and blue screen. And they were basically large-scale paintings in the palettes of bright green and bright blue. And they were sort of envisioned as these blue screens or green screens, which, if anyone's familiar, those are these kind of cinematic tools that are used by actors usually to create a background that is other than where they are. So if you know about like the weather forecast, you know, you see someone
standing in front of a green screen.
Exactly.
And you can see a map.
We see a map because the green has been keyed out, and so in special effects. So anyway, I was thinking about how during the pandemic, so much art and life, but I was thinking about painting specifically, was getting viewed through the lens of a camera filter, right? We were looking at our art on our phones, computers, exhibition spaces were closed, so that was very much the way we could experience painting. I was also thinking about Zoom and the sort of space that we were all communicating through, and how people would often change their backgrounds outward to be elsewhere from where they were. And so I basically kind of conflated these two ideas and started creating these large green and blue paintings that were paintings. They were, you know, real paintings, but they were also functionally potential green screens and blue screens that I could then key out and remove from like a recording. So I created some of these works, and then like a year later, I started to take these paintings through the city streets. I've done some of these walks in New Haven, in New York. I'm doing one in Asheville this fall. And basically creating a video piece of me physically holding these really, really large unwieldy paintings. I can actually thank Maureen also for having helped me at one point move one of these paintings to the street outside. So basically me creating this like almost procession with a painting in my body's like grasp.
They're very big.
They're big, they're heavy, they are not easy to move. And then having this video recording, which after the fact I have keyed out with some, you know, green screen filter, and then replace the painting with historic images of the city streets through which I'm walking. So you basically get this hybrid video of contemporary life, the painting being moved through 2024 streets of New York or New Haven or wherever it is, and then these images of the past versions of these places that sort of replace the green of the painting. And so you kind of have this vision of me kind of holding the past up, you might say, in the space of a painting. And it's both extremely physical and it's also entirely digital because it's only possible through this keying out. It's a little hard. I don't know if that description is clear. It's, there's online links to
yes,
this.
it's online. So you can sort of see the shops that Julia is passing, but at a certain stage, as they were in, I don't know, like 1900, 1910, like a very long time ago, this sort of black and white image sort of shimmers over the screen that she's carrying, and you can see people, a bit like, the portal now, which is the New York portal, which is linking Dublin and New York, of bringing these two worlds together in that way. And again, what interested me very much about it was, again, this idea of time, of almost like a palimpsest. You've got the present and you've got the past, and both of them are sort of moving images as well, and to see that as well, I thought that was really, really great. And the other thing is your sister made the film, and you can hear her laughing at various points as Julia struggles with this big
And we've taught, so she's the videographer, and then also has helped with the editing process and the research of these archival images. So in the case of the video you saw, we did research at the New York Historical Society and found these streets, like Franklin Street or Lispenard Street from 100 years ago. And it very much, I think, also had to do with our own upbringing in New York. And I think there's something about like a city, like really any city, but a city that has just so many layers of time in it. Like you're living, and I think Rome is a great example, and you talk so much about Italy in this book, but a city that you have like medieval time, Renaissance time, contemporary time, all cobbled together. And that is, I just think, so essential.
It's wonderful, and to produce a work which does that layering. Should we take some questions now, Marlene? Okay. Grand. Any questions?
No.
Sorry.
I was going to comment, but maybe to get your feedback. When you were reading selections, there's something talking about the present and being in reality that someone reading to you seems so enjoyable compared to seeing it either on the screen or even reading a book yourself. And, that fact itself, I'm wondering what your comment would be.
Well, I said earlier that, I personally feel the loss of a lot of like analog, if you want to call it that way, things, things like handwriting. We could talk a lot about that as well. Things like handwriting that isn't being encouraged now. People tend not to write by hand at all. And again, that's a lovely thing. And the envelope Julia had, like the English poet Ted Hughes said, how you get a real sense of a whole personality when you see somebody's handwriting. If you get a letter, and that can be very moving, if you find a letter or a card from somebody who maybe is no longer alive, your granny or some very, very old thing, and you come across these old documents, they're alive in that way. And similarly, reading aloud, these things that are so simple and human and real, to use that word again, I think that they're very, very important. So thank you.
Maybe you've said this, but do you have siblings, Deirdre?
I had one sibling. I had a sister, and she was very close to me and very supportive to me. She's no longer with us, unfortunately, but my relationship with her was very, very important. But I haven't, written consciously about her, and a lot of the sibling relationships would be very different. I think a lot of my interest, it's to use your word again, instinctive. a lot of the things I've written about as well. When I was a child, or when I was young, I read the Brontes a lot. And again, having studied English literature, I read people like Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. Like, their relationship was absolutely amazing. And her journals are so, so beautiful, and a real relationship to his poems. But I never decided consciously I'm going to write about sisters or brothers in that way. My mother came from an extremely big family, and they were all very close. I only had one sister, no brothers, and my mother was from this really big family, and they were all so fond of each other and all into each other. And I think that as well influenced me very much. I thought, without even thinking about it, I always thought, this is a good relationship. And my brother too, my father too, had one brother, and he was very close to him. So I think having grown up with everybody really into their siblings, that really encouraged me a lot, as well as things I would have read and thought about. So thanks. Somebody at the very back, and then I'll go to you, sir. Sorry.
I was just wondering, in terms of literary tradition or theme, do you think there are distinct literary traditions of like sister novels, brother novels, and then like other, I don't know, some other kind of mixed sibling theme?
I think it's a very important subject, and I think it hasn't been looked at as much in that explicit way, whereas people look a lot at like mother-daughter novels or stories or father-son literature. You know, there's a lot of that, and I think there's a lot of probably academic writing very consciously about that. And there's a certain amount about siblings, but I don't know that that the sort of value of that relationship is seen as much. I don't know if that answers your questions, but I don't think that it's as foregrounded. I don't see it myself within that much of a. It's there if you look for it and you think about it. I say housekeeping is a case in point as well. There's lots of novels where it is an issue, but maybe critically or academically, it's not foregrounded as much as say like marriage novels or parents, children. So, thank you. Thank you.
Maybe in a similar vein, I'm interested in the negative side of this sibling rivalry, the negative tone to that. With your work with your sister, how did that relationship?
That one's for you, Julia.
Over the few years you've been doing it together.
It's a great question. So me and my sister were very, very close growing up, and I would say, as you grow up, you also, you fight. And I would say, fought a lot in the kind of teenage years. We're 4 years apart. So when she went to college, I would say we were, continued to just be close, but never really worked together. The first time we started working together was in 2011. And again, neither of us were living in the same place. And I would say our relationship, I foreground that she's a poet and I'm an artist, and that is the reason that we work together, not because we're sisters. We happen to be sisters, but I see her as a writer who inspires me, and she sees me as an artist who inspires her. And the fact that we're siblings is both essential but also sort of beside the point. And I would say that the ways that we've collaborated have kind of given this dimension to our relationship that is almost, I want to say it's like a distant, it has nothing to do with our like lived life in a certain sense. And you talk about this also in the book of like the kind of the remove that you actually have to have from your work. Your work is so personal in a certain sense, in the sense that it comes out of you, but it also is totally autonomous and separate from you and doesn't always translate or reflect back on who you are. And I believe that the work that we do together has, in a lot of ways, very little to do with our relationship, at the same time that it is, again, this kind of deep intuition that I don't think would necessarily be as possible if we weren't having come out of this shared lineage. So it's, our relationship artistically is very different than our relationship as sisters. And I think sometimes talking about it, people think, oh, you must be so close with her. And yes, but also it doesn't actually have much bearing.
In a different way. It's like how you feel about maybe getting together for Christmas or something like that is different to working together, and how you, it's a very, like making art, be it painting or writing or whatever, it's what you've just said, Julia. You're trying to make something that's separate from yourself and distant from yourself. And even if you're putting a lot of your own lived experience into it, it should be something else. And that's what I think you're getting at in your relationship with your sister. It's not like, oh, it's all about us. And if you were to write something or to create something, it's just different. Like the whole family thing is different in that way. I really get that.
And it doesn't, I think it has something, there was an essay written a few, I don't know, remember when, anyway, I read it a few years ago, and it's this point stuck with me so much. The work of this particular painter, they said it's personal, but it's not autobiographical. Yes. And so it's personal in the sense that it comes out of you, but it's not autobiographical in the sense that it ends with you. It ends actually in the public space, and yet it maybe resonates with the public because it is so deeply and individually felt, but it's not about like my life. No one cares. Who cares about my life? My life isn't important. Yes. But if my life can be a vessel through which someone can feel something about their own life or about, the world at large, I think then maybe the painting can be successful if it doesn't end with me. Yes, it sort of comes out and then.
I absolutely get that. It's the difference between, just like a family circumstance and work. I'm trying to think of examples that would help with this. Maybe, maybe even somebody like, I hesitate to say this, maybe even somebody like Sylvia Plath, and you can read all about the anguish in her life. But then you have some of these very, very pure poems, which have the anguish has been sort of refined out of it in some way into pure poetry. And it's something along those lines. And I think she's a good example and a bad example because we sort of know so much, all the nitty-gritty of arguments and things she was doing in the kitchen and whatever. Like it's all out there through letters and gossip and biographies and whatever. But if you read like the Bee poems or a poem like Daddy Daddy, it's the essence of the trauma has been brought down to this poem that would be completely powerful and intelligible even if you didn't know all these other biographical facts about her. That's the best attempt I can make to explain that. So there's one lady there.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, okay. Yep, I can see. Thanks.
I just wanted to speak to how when you held up her artwork with the envelope, and you said how it can take on a new, as time goes by, it can take a new meaning. I thought that was so profound because this is how art is. Art is very subjective. But another way that it takes on a new meaning is I may look at a painting today and I can't stand it. And then, depending on my life experiences and events,
absolutely, yes,
I can come back to that same painting and it's beautiful.
Yes.
So I think what happens as a people is that we don't give art a chance sometimes, and I think that's just important for people to know. And of course, I'm an artist, that's why I'm saying it. I think we give up on it too quickly. And it's the same thing with writing, because that's art as well. So you may not like the book when you first read it, but sometimes even if you like it the first time, if you read it a second time, you'll get more meaning, a deeper meaning. So it's like we need to give it a chance.
Yeah, that's a terrific point, and it points to me like the value of rereading as well, because you can read a book. I remember reading books at university and struggling with them and thinking they were very boring, and then maybe coming across them years later and they're so marvelous. And there are writers that you have to be ready, like there's some writers, like D.H. Lawrence, who you can sort of, because he's very sort of emotional and all over the place, he really speaks to very young people, I think. But then there are writers like Wordsworth or Proust or Henry James, and you need a lot of life behind you before you can really bring your own experience and get what they're getting at. But if you read these people when you're very young, you think, oh, what a bore, But it's that, you aren't bringing, and there's some writers in, and your lived experience will never click with theirs and they're just not for you. And there's no harm in that. So not everybody's for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.